Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Hubbell, and I'm the co-chair of the ISPE Boston Chapter's Educational Programs Committee. It's now 3 p.m., and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Risk Management Closing Panel discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our Week 1 sponsor, NECI, as well as our Platinum sponsor, Alberio Energy. All attendees are muted by default. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the Q&A session on Pigeonhole. A link to the Q&A platform has been provided in the chat box. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, as well as vote on questions that are submitted by others. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We also have the option of raising your hand virtually within the chat box. And if you would like, you can go on screen to ask your question and get your response from the speakers. So you've got two ways to submit your questions, either live or via the Q&A panel if you're feeling shy. With that, I would like to now introduce our speakers. First, we have Lynn Tokarczyk, who is the Government Tax Incentives Consultant and President at Business Development Strategies Incorporated. Thank you, Lynn. We also have Francesca McBride, who is a Regulatory Specialist Director at Jacobs. Thank you, Francesca. Yeah. We also have Nissan Cohen, who is the President of Pharmaceutical Water Dock. Thank you for joining us today, Nissan. And finally, we have John Cunningham, who's the Director of Business and Industrial IT at RoviSys. Thank you also, John, for joining us. So with that, I would like to start our panel discussion by asking each of our panelists to give a brief overview or key takeaways of the talk that you gave earlier this week. And then from there, we'll move into some questions for each of you that will hopefully spur some discussion and opportunities to look for common threads throughout your various talks. So with that, why don't we start with Lynn? If you could give us a brief overview and key takeaways of your conversation around tax incentives and tax breaks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And it was a pleasure to join the panel at my presentation this afternoon. We were on at 12 p.m. So we were chatting about accessing, identifying, negotiating, and securing state and local tax incentives for proposed real estate expansions in Massachusetts. And essentially going through, we went through the process. It's a local and state process, getting boards of selectmen, finance committee, town meeting approvals, state approvals. But what was important is that if companies have proposed real estate expansion plans, thinking about growing your real estate space, whether it's expanding your current facility, finding a new location, putting a shovel in the ground at an alternative location, there are many resources to help you offset your project costs and help you save cash. And really, it's all about timing. And I think the theme here is that if companies aren't aware of these programs, then they're going to leave cash on the table. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you, Francesca. You spoke this morning about using risk-based approaches to confirm quality, safety, efficacy attributes for ATMPs. I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview and some key takeaways from that talk this morning.
Sure, thank you very much. So in the last, let's just say 5 or so years, the manufacturing of advanced therapy medicinal products, which are ATMPs, has really expanded beyond what was originally the early phase clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, which were really being done within hospitals, medical schools, because they're very close to the patients, and now transferring over to much more to manufacturing operations and looking at commercial manufacturing. And so timing with that, in 2017, the EMA came out with their new guideline that is for GMPs as they apply to the ATMP products. And in that document, there was a fairly extensive discussion about the application of quality risk management and assessment and how that should be done. And so the discussion that I gave today was to be able to share the expectations around the regulations and applying the ICH-Q9, which is about risk assessments, to that process, and what are the different things that need to be looked at, and what's the strategy for the execution and the tools. And relative to the expectation or the things you're really looking at your process manufacturing and the operations from a risk of contamination to the product, cross-contamination, mix-ups because of the multiple operations, and even multiple patient products, because of, in the cellular therapy, you're dealing with a lot of individual patient products, personalized medicine there. And so those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. And then where do we need to apply those, and how do we apply? And then what do you do when you're assessing the risks that could occur relative to, is there a need to implement new procedures or changes to the design such that you can control those risks to avoid the impact to product quality and safety?
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to hand it over to Nissan. If you could give us a brief overview and takeaways from your talk earlier this week on Tuesday around emerging technologies in pharmaceutical water systems.
Primarily what we were dealing with is the idea of non-distilled water manufacturing for WFI water systems. Getting rid of hot WFI water, getting rid of 80-degree C water, getting rid of the energy associated with that, and the carbon footprints. As we move forward and we have more corporate responsibility and individual responsibility as entities in order to make sure that our carbon footprints are reduced, how can we do this from an energy and a utility standpoint? So now that we have been able to coordinate between the United States Pharmacopoeia and the European Pharmacopoeia, that both non-distilled WFI water can be produced and ambient WFI water is now respectively used, the question now becomes, how can we get the industry to move forward to accept the idea of non-distilled WFI water without hot water, without ambient water, without steam, and without all the energy things that we've lived with over decades and decades of utility usage in the pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Great, thank you so much. I can certainly see some ties between that talk and how you would operate within the ICH-Q9 framework that Francesca just mentioned, as far as you justify those alternative approaches. So then finally, I'd like to hand it over to John. John, you spoke also on Tuesday about business continuity and resiliency, and how do we, what role do we play in terms of planning for our future? So key takeaways from that talk, please.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and thanks everyone for your time today and on Tuesday as well. So the focus of the talk on Tuesday, as Aaron indicated, was really around business continuity in the manufacturing space. And the conversation's really been driven in the last few years by a number of things that have happened. One of the big ones is cybersecurity breaches that have happened to many organizations, not just in life sciences, but across the manufacturing spectrum. Some of the weather conditions in Puerto Rico back in 2017, the things that wiped out a number of plants. And then just this year, the COVID situation and how different our operational profile is today than it was even just 6 or 8 months ago. So one of the things that we're looking at is when you start talking about risk to the manufacturing operation and to business continuity, we just cannot anticipate what it's going to be, what our risk is going to be. So we don't know what the next one will be. The only thing we can pretty much be sure about is that there will be another one. So the focus of the presentation was really around how do you develop a resiliency plan? What are the steps you need to take? How do you evaluate the risks? Who are the players that you need to have in the mix as you look at it? And so I think some of the key takeaways from that presentation and what we were trying to convey there, number one is that the team has to be holistic. You need people from throughout the organization, from an executive champion who's going to help drive the initiative. You need people from IT, you need people from the information security team, and certainly you need the stakeholders and the system owners from manufacturing, the people that are going to be living with the systems that we put in, the approaches that we take to cyber resiliency. and then the information security people in the manufacturing space. So it's really the coming together of all these different groups of people to figure out what does the cyber resiliency profile look like for your organization? What risks are there? Which ones are you willing to accept? Which ones do you need to mitigate based on location and operational issues? How long do you need to be able to run if something does happen without the full system? And how do you get back in terms of incident response and disaster recovery? How quickly can you get back on your feet with a full operation? So that's kind of the highlights of, I think, what the takeaways would be.
Interesting, thank you. And so I'm going to stick with you for a second, John, if that's all right. So I'm going to ask this of all of the panelists, and we'll just go around the virtual room here. But I want to start with you, John, because you mentioned it here in your overview. You also specifically called this out within your presentation. Within your area of expertise, how has the pandemic changed your perspective on risk? If you can take a snapshot of where you are today and compare that to where you were in, say, January or February, what's changed for you? How are you approaching things differently?
So, yeah, it's been a very, for all of us, it's been a very dynamic year as we've tried to adjust to this new normal. So some of the things that we've seen, so we're an engineering company, so we are in the manufacturing facilities working with the system owners and the production folks. And what we're seeing is the first disruptor of everybody not being able to work in their traditional workspace was really added a lot of new risks that were not there before. We have for years, many people have been working remotely, but a lot of that tends to be in parts of the business that don't require you to be in the manufacturing facility. There's some things that just cannot be done remotely in the manufacturing facility. So suddenly we have the engineering team, the instrumentation team, the validation team, the operation team trying to figure out how to do things remotely. So that's the first thing is a lot of systems were adjusted, new third-party access so that people could get in from their computer at home. Sometimes it was their computer, not a company or corporate computer to be able to dial into things. People were getting in on their cell phones, which are inherently insecure, or their tablets to be able to try to get in and do their jobs. And a lot of times these were put in very quickly to try to keep production moving for the products. So that's the first one, is the systems going in quickly. The second area of risk that we've seen is around where you do have to have the workforce in the manufacturing space. How do you make sure that your workers are safe? How do you make sure that the social distancing requirements are being met when these people, they're trying to socially distance, but they're side by side or they're moving something around and trying to get things done. The good thing is in a lot of our industry, folks are already used to gowning up and wearing masks and other things. So it's not as bad as in some other spaces, but that's the second one, is keeping staff safe. And then the third one is the ramp up around vaccines. Many of our peers in this industry have been hit with brand new initiatives that are funded, and the demand is very high on producing either products they were already producing or doing research and trying to come to market and produce vaccines very quickly. So scaling these things up from a manufacturing perspective has meant new staff coming in who's not necessarily familiar with how to do things in this space. That's new risk. Additional systems coming in, tying systems together that have not been tied together before. All of these things are risk factors. So if you're able to do these in a timely fashion, you can do the risk analysis as part of the process and in the right stages before you do things. We're having to do the risk analysis in some cases on the fly and then adjust to that dynamically. So it's a very fluid situation that we're seeing from a risk perspective.
Interesting, thank you. And I'm wondering, so to tie into that last point you made around new technologies and trying to move faster, I want to kick the question over to you, Nissan. And has the availability of some of these alternative high purity water generation methods, has the pandemic affected that in terms of firms needing to scale up, being able to put these in place? Are there advantages through some of these other technologies versus the traditional distillation that has enabled that. So, but also, of course, if there's other ways that the pandemic has changed how you're looking at and dealing with risk within your area of expertise, I'd love to hear about that as well.
This pharmaceutical industry has been very, very reticent to adopt new technologies over the past 30 or 40 years. And because they've been reticent to adopt technologies during the pandemic, this has hampered them in order to do remote diagnostics and remote analysis. Water systems by their nature are completely automated, but the instrumentation that's used in order to show that the water is qualified or meeting the mandate for the United States Pharmacopoeia could be online or could be offline in a laboratory. When you have data that is going to the laboratory and is offline, you can't adequately determine what the operational health is of the water system or those utilities or the production areas. PAT, process analytical technology, was developed by the FDA in 2004, 16 years ago, to allow the pharmaceutical industry to get past that in order to move forward on automation and ideas. How many batch systems are there still being operational at this particular time? There's a lack of automation, a lack of technology and adoption. And during the pandemic, this is a completely apparent, because engineers and people cannot have access to the operations of their water systems by remote computers properly. Everything is done on site and done a lot with paperwork and done offline. And this has hampered the industry in order to move forward during this time period.
Yeah, interesting. Francesca, I'd like to ask you the same question, because again, I'm sure that there's elements of what Nissan had just mentioned that would, as I said earlier, would fit into that ICHQ9 framework. So again, back at the beginning of the year to today, risk, are you thinking about it differently? How has that impacted your approach?
Well, from a risk standpoint, the COVID-19 has brought on some new things that we have to think about relative to risks of contamination. And part of that, you know, in many more cases, it's because of the operators themselves and the people that are going in and out of the facility. And when you think about the manufacturing operations, it's not necessarily 24/7, but it's quite a bit of time people are in the facilities. And yet, as we know, we had an extended period of time where we did not have testing that could be done to verify whether people were negative or positive from an exposure standpoint. So that in itself brought on an added risk to contamination for the product and even the facility, and needing to think about that and how does that get addressed and what might be those additional controls that need to be put in place. Even though, yes, we have gowning and things like that, even with this kind of exposure, people aren't wearing that gowning from the very point that they come into the building. There still is indeed that risk of contamination. So it's added that need to think about that in consideration. Hopefully, of course, that's going to be one that will go away, you know, once, you know, we have indeed that treatment and things like that, but it's brought an additional perspective that we've had to take into consideration because of that. And with that, you know, you have, especially in the cellular therapy, because of the personalized medicine, you have so many more, if you will, individual products that have to get, you know, considered from a risk of exposure. So that's definitely brought in and changed some of the thinking of specific things to that.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. And then finally, Lynn, you know, I'm not a tax person by any stretch of the imagination. So is there an impact to your work, working on tax incentives, to the pandemic, in terms of how you're thinking about risk? Have things shifted for you as you're working with your clients and providing guidance around how to best leverage and use some of those tax structures?
Well, I will say from the onset of the pandemic, what we were seeing is I was receiving many phone calls from our clients that had just received tax incentives, and now they were going to move forward with putting a shovel in the ground. And then, of course, due to all and they were very uncertain, you know, the world was uncertain when they could move forward. So many of them were, even though they were manufacturing and technology, innovations, many of them were declared to be unessential businesses. So fortunately for those that were considered to be essential businesses, they were able to move forward. So, you know, in that respect, due to that, the whole level of uncertainty, and that, you know, to some degree put those businesses at risk because they could not meet their customer demands in the time frame that they had agreed upon. So the construction projects were on hold. And so, you know, the good news, I think it was like in June-ish, you know, that's when the construction was able to commence in most of the municipalities. So regarding the tax incentives, what we're seeing is not really so much, you know, risk, but it's just a different way of doing business virtually. You know, typically the businesses would be meeting with boards of selectmen and developing relationships, you know, sitting around a board table, you know, the various boards and committees at the municipal level and the state level for that matter. And now it's, you know, it's Zoom and other platforms. So it's a little different. So it's, you know, you have to be a little more creative when making introductions because, you know, you could have 15 people on a Zoom meeting. No one knows anyone except for me. So I'm introducing, you know, a company to the local officials. So it's, you know, it's a different way of doing business, but it's working. And, you know, you have to make it work to see a positive outcome. And even with town meetings, typically there are community information sessions. So the residents of the community can get a chance to meet with the company executives and perhaps see their products. You know, many times there's a trade show display. So the community, because they need to vote on these tax incentives and they want to know who are we offering these tax incentives to. We want to be able to establish some type of relationship and get to know who the leadership is of these particular companies. So obviously information sessions are not happening, but they are happening virtually. Again, so it's very different. We have to be creative and very, very engaging and in order to see a positive outcome.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'd like to stick with you for a minute, Lynn, if we could, because we've got a few questions around tax incentives specifically from our audience. One of those is around what is the landscape for these tax incentives for life science projects in New England? Typically, Massachusetts has had a strong program of tax incentives, but it feels like the other New England states have lagged. Is there more competition? What's going on in the greater New England ecosystem beyond just Massachusetts?
Well, I will have to say I used to work for Ernst & Young, so New England was my territory, and Massachusetts has the most lucrative program. Some of the other New England states have programs, but they're very, very different. We had talked about tax increment financing, a TIF program, which is companies can access getting a discount on future real estate taxes, again, which can be very substantial, very lucrative. New Hampshire, their definition of a TIF is infrastructure, roadway improvements, water, sewer, etc. So every state has something a little different, but Massachusetts has a very specific program. And again, it's been used as a national model throughout the years. And you know, as I mentioned, you know, the other states do have programs, but they're more or less far and few between.
Okay, thank you for that. Another one of our audience questions is for you, John. They'd like to hear a bit more about who within an organization would be the right person to lead a cyber resiliency initiative, and how would they go about convincing executives to buy in and to fund that, and then as well as really getting that buy-in from the manufacturing team, the people on the front line that it's likely to most heavily impact. We'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's the whole thing right there is those buy-ins. You know, the technology in most things we do, technology is a small part. It's the human interaction, which is the challenge. So in terms of who would be the leader, I think it probably needs to start with somebody who understands the landscape, the the resiliency landscape by looking around to see what's happened in our industry in the last few years with organizations that have either been attacked from a cyber perspective or who have lost facilities, significant downtime through to hurricanes or other kinds of weather conditions, or even the response that we're seeing now in terms of production issues around COVID. So it's understanding that first. So who is it that really understands that? Usually it needs to be somebody fairly high in the organization, either from an operational perspective or an information perspective. So some of the titles of people that might be on board with this would be a CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, or the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, a CTO, Chief Technology Officer, or on the manufacturing side, somebody like a VP of Operations. So there needs to be somebody at that level who understands this is a legitimate concern and something the organization needs to be paying attention to. And then what they would be doing is through their staffs, they begin to say, what's our current posture? What is our position right now? And begin to do the risk analysis to see where are we exposed? What is the risk we have? And for that, it's really bringing in both the information technology side, those folks who understand the infrastructure components, as well as the information security team. Those two will understand from a high level, this is what we need to be working from. And then buying in, getting the buy-in from the manufacturing team, actually looking at the various sites to say, what do we have out in those sites? What kind of exposure do we have? How old are the sites? Is there any kind of continuity between them? In our industry, one of the things we see over and over again is through merger and acquisitions. You'll have one company with 50 sites and they came from 20 different other places. So there's no coherence between them. So it's really beginning to get your arms around what does this mean? What does cyber resiliency mean for our organization? In terms of getting the buy-in of the manufacturing organization, that can be a challenge early on because they're not necessarily going to see the value to them of doing this. And it's really important to think of it as two different parts. One is as an insurance policy. Just like if you go out and buy an insurance policy, it's hard sometimes to see the value you're getting out of that unless there's some sort of a problem where it has to pay up. The same is true here. So that's the first part. But a bigger part of it, and what we're seeing more and more in the industry now, is where there's actual return on investment for the work that's being done here. And it comes in a couple of different forms. The first one is just by looking at these systems, there's a lot of things that are being noticed by the manufacturing operations where they can say, oh, we weren't noticed, we didn't know that was in that condition. Let's go take care of that. So they're doing these small projects just to take care of things that really needed to be taken care of anyway, but nobody was really looking at them. But that provides some very immediate return on investment. The other place for some return on investment is there's some modernizing of equipment or automating of things that may not have been done before. Nissan mentioned that with water systems. We see that throughout the industry. There's a lot of things that are still being done by paper, the chance for errors and other things that go on in that case, the ability to do those if there's some sort of a disruption.
Sounds like we have, oh, there we go.
I'm sorry, did I get lost there for a minute?
No, you froze. One of the ironies as you were speaking about cyber resiliency was that either on one of our ends, the connection dropped for a moment. We have you back now, so
Okay.
we'll let you continue on.
Okay, just to wrap that up, as the manufacturing folks begin to see there's a return on investment for the investments they're going to be making into this, that's an important part of it, because if you're asking your plants to pay for this, you're competing with dollars that could go into improved manufacturing operations. You have to show some return on that investment. And that's what we find really helps to get buy-in. Executive level commitment and championship, IT and InfoSec, and then bringing the manufacturing people along from day one.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to direct the next question over to you, Francesca. So we've got a question about performing quality risk assessments for facilities. During the design phase, should the risk assessment consider future phases of the facility expansion as they apply to manufacturing? How forward-looking ought that be in consideration of the future expansion needs when they're doing that assessment?
We certainly think that taking that aspect and looking at it is a very good thing to be done in the initial risk assessments. As I mentioned, there's the risk assessments that focus on process closure, what steps are open or closed, and environmental quality and things like that. And then there are those risks that are looking at contamination and mix-ups and things like that that occur because of flows through the area and the way the operations are performed in the different spaces. And especially in that area, looking at the phased construction that might occur is an important thing, so that are there any additional controls that should be put in place day one to mitigate there being a risk of contamination for when the next phase of those operations are, because certainly, most especially in the cellular therapy processing, when these facilities go up, they can't shut down. And so even having a minimal period of time that is designated for, let's just say, annual maintenance, be it HEPA filter changes, things like that, have to be taken consideration as to how is that going to impact the ability for the ongoing processing to occur. And so if we're having to look at that, then we also want to be thinking about the adjacencies of those future spaces and where they're going to be and what kind of maybe initial construction has to go in such that you can avoid the impact of any kind of contamination risk occurring to those spaces by the adjacent operations of construction that are going on. And so we certainly recommend that that's the type of thing to look at for that phased construction. And it may apply to the QC laboratories, it may apply to the manufacturing process suites themselves, or even to storage areas and warehousing. It's just a matter of looking at those future build outs. What are those spaces? How are those flows through those spaces going to occur? And where might there be a risk of, let's just say, construction activities impacting this, so that then you can consider those flows right up front.
Thank you. And I'd like to piggyback off of that to go over to you, Lynn. You know, as we talk about assessing risk for facility expansion, construction projects, et cetera, as companies are looking and assessing at initiating these projects, you know, is there a project size, you know, capital expenditure that we would say is too small to start pursuing tax incentives, or is there a sweet spot? Like, well, where do you see, how big do we need that project to be before companies start reaching out to their municipalities? And then at what point in that evaluation process ought they reach out to you know, a specialized advisement person such as yourself to help guide them through that process?
Right. Well, I'll start with the second question. So basically, when we get involved with a project, a company could be working with their architect to, you know, they may have existing space that they've outgrown. And so they may have a conversation with their architect, their general contractor, to figure out, okay, how much space do we need? You know, we need to purchase additional machinery and equipment. Do we need 50,000 square feet? Do we need 100,000 square feet? So while they're determining how much space they need, they're also determining the cost of that space, the cost of real estate. And they may not be able to do it to construct that or to renovate an existing building. They may just not have the space. They could be bursting at the seams. So now they've got to, so that's a time when we oftentimes receive phone calls from the architect or the general contractor or other related firms to just give us a very high level snapshot of what the potential project could look like, the potential capital expenditure, you know, the square footage of a building, if it's a new construction or a renovation. So we can more or less pre-qualify and see if they would be eligible, number one, to move forward with that, you know, if they would be eligible to move forward with pursuing some type of tax incentives. And so once that's determined, that's a very good question, because that does come up a lot as far as how much do they need to spend or what's the size of the building. Well, it really varies, because if it's a 50,000 square foot building and they're looking to renovate the building. We'll say they're planning on spending $2 million to renovate the building, $3 million for machinery and equipment, personal property, and it's a 50,000 square foot building. It's unlikely it's going to increase the assessed value and bring new tax revenue to the municipality, which is a requirement, because that's the essential idea of these tax incentives. Whatever the new taxes are, known as tax increment financing, a TIF, which is a discount on future taxes, that's where the conversation begins. So if the assessed value isn't going to increase, I'm sure the company's not going to, that won't bother them. If their taxes won't increase, I'm sure they'll be happy about that. But for more, so then again, if it's a $2 million spend, or if it's a 100,000 square foot building, or going back to the 50,000 square feet, we'd really want to see more of a $5 million real estate spend in order to see the assessed value increase. So the $2 million doesn't really work, but a $5 million could work. Now, moving upwards to a larger facility, we recently worked with a 200,000 square foot facility. It was vacant. It had been sitting there for a number of years, unused, and the company was spending approximately $100 million to renovate the building. Well, obviously that's going to increase the assessed value. The company will be subject to paying more real estate taxes. And again, the beauty about a TIF is that whatever the existing building is, the company will continue to pay full taxes on that. It's what is the expansion project and what are the new taxes coming into the town. So that's the piece that's actually negotiated. So if it's a 200,000 square foot building, it's, a $50 million spend, 60, 80, 100 million, it's most likely going to increase the value, and then that could be eligible. But sometimes these buildings that are in the 50,000 square foot range, we need to see, a more substantial renovation spend. And sometimes they just don't qualify if the assessed value of the building is not going to increase.
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you. Definitely food for thought for those of us who may be considering facility expansions, and at what point we ought to begin asking those questions and trying to chase that down. So I want to move over back to you, Nissan. John had talked a little bit about building buy-in, getting engagement for cyber resiliency. With regards to these alternative sources of WIFI generation, non-distilled sources, what are some of the challenges that you've seen in terms of getting alignment across the various agencies, and even within companies, between, say, an engineering unit and a quality unit coming to agreement, and how have you seen, or maybe you could tell us about some of the success factors that would allow people wanting to implement such non-distilled water technologies? What has driven those to success where others maybe have failed in terms of getting that internal and external buy-in to that technology?
Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry does not run on an economic basis. No one is going to a large pharmaceutical company and saying, we're going to cut the engineering budget by 50%. You're going to produce the same amount of pharmaceuticals you did last year at the same quality, the same efficacy, and even better throughput. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen in the pharmaceutical industry, but it should. Because if it did, it means that the technology aspects of new development and adaptation would become more prevalent in the industry. Right now, an engineering manager, if he wants to, can do something the way it's been done for the last 30 years. Unfortunately, a lot of the engineering firms still using boilerplates that were developed 15, 20, and 30 years ago and haven't changed substantially. So part of it is the engineering groups on one side haven't moved forward because their customers, the pharmaceutical industry, is not demanding that they move forward. The economics associated with it are exorbitant. Example is that if I can show someone how they can save $5 or $6 million a year just on energy costs and non-wastage of water, don't forget we pay for water coming into this facility, we produce it, and then we send it down the drain. Many times we're using WFI water and purified water, which is excellent water for rinsing operations and sending it down the drain. That costs a lot of money. And I can show people how to save that money and to get rid of a lot of the issues associated with wastewater. However, there has to be an incentive from the pharmaceutical industry in getting the finance people involved with the manufacturing people. I have never been, in my 40 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry, I have never been in a meeting with engineering and finance at the same time. Because engineering is not interested in saving money unless someone says, okay, is this going to meet regulatory issues and increase regulatory issues? And the point is if it doesn't, why should we do it? A finance guy sees how the company can save tens or hundreds of millions of dollars across the board at many different sites and is going to say, yes, we should instigate these types of programs. But it's not instigated on a site-by-site basis. So those are part of the issues. How can we get management involved? Let management come into meetings with production and with manufacturing that will allow them to see that there are equitable technology options available to them that have very little risk if they're willing to change the SOPs, adapt the new technology, develop the C&Q options in order to develop this and to move forward.
Would you, I definitely appreciate your comments, around not being a financially driven industry with this, perhaps with the innovator companies, but I'm wondering with CMOs where, they're looking at typically fixed batch pricing, and utility usage oftentimes is looked at as an overhead cost. And so whatever those CMOs can do to drop those overhead costs, that's profit back to them. Are you seeing a difference in terms of how innovator companies versus CMOs are evaluating these?
Yes, CMOs, if they're doing that on an operational basis for themselves, but don't forget CMOs are also going to their clients and their clients are paying a premium for them to manufacture a given product. They have to follow the mandate of their client. If the client says the recipe is going to be this way, A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, then they're going to do that. They're not going to offer a new technology to company X when company X says, I have the recipe, your job is to manufacture it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. I want to shift gears a little bit, move it over to Francesca. So we've got a question for you. How has thinking around ATMP manufacturing facilities evolved over the past few years? So both for autologous and allogenic products, and what are some of the major trends that you're seeing?
So certainly, just because of the ATMP manufacturing has gotten tremendous amount of growth in the, probably 5 to 10 years. I mean, as I said, going now into commercial manufacturing, be it on the gene therapy processing or the cellular therapy processing, it's certainly expanding and getting a lot of focus globally. And so certainly we are having not only, agencies, regulatory agencies around the world taking greater focus on these processing and starting to look at, but also you have the manufacturing companies, and even from processing and the equipment is different. A lot of the process equipment that is used in the cellular therapy operations is brand new to manufacturing, if you will. It is the kind of thing that certainly came from research and development, and so these types of equipment were not traditionally used in the manufacture of other types of products, monoclonal antibodies or traditional vaccines and things like that. And so with that, what we're certainly finding is that there's a greater need to not only within the companies themselves as the manufacturing look and understand this equipment and how it's used, but also when they're presenting to the regulatory agencies, they themselves don't necessarily have familiarity with the equipment. And so the questions that are coming up during those discussions are certainly different from ones that have happened before. And so needing to be able to convey that type of knowledge and the assurance is indeed very important. So that's one thing. And we are seeing a stronger drive towards consideration for unidirectional flows on the cellular therapy operations. Certainly it's the kind of thing that we had gotten away from on monoclonal antibody manufacturing and going back to that. But because of, especially with the personalized medicine and the risk of mix-ups, in addition to the fact that you're adding in the viral vector manufacturing and addition to the processing, so they're looking now more at going back to unidirectional flow. And I think another consideration that's having to come to this processing is the fact that, again, in the cellular therapy, because it's personalized medicine, so the patient cells are coming in, they're getting processed, and then go back directly to that patient. There's no filtration process through that step. And so now we are back applying the need to really reconsider sterile manufacturing, aseptic processing strategies, even in what might be our traditional bulk manufacturing operations of expansion and some of the purification steps, which we had traditionally gone to, maybe grade D or even grade C operation. So is it appropriate to do that here in these? So this is some of the consideration that's having to be applied. And then certainly from a future standpoint, one of the things that is certainly desired and is already getting consideration is how are we able to automate more of these processes, because the equipment that is used for this process, being a cell counter or a cell washer or something, they're single unit operations that are performed at a single station, and they don't necessarily do transfer from equipment one to the next equipment. And so these are operations that the operators have to get very involved in and be there. And so what is starting to happen is to look at where and what can be automated so that can reduce some of this burden that is there, both from an operator's as well as risk of contamination. So these are the kinds of things that are getting considered now. And then I guess the other one that I think of about operations is, as you mentioned, contract manufacturing organizations, a lot of those have been used for the viral vector production. And so companies are bringing in that already prepared viral vector and cell therapies, and maybe the only thing they're having to do is a thaw transfer to a device for addition. But now they're actually starting to consider adding manufacturing operations for the production of the viral vectors, just because there's such a great need for this. So the competition and availability is something. So we're certainly seeing a number of different changes occurring, need for new thinking in the way that these manufacturing operations are being performed in the different stations. Certainly there's an extremely enhanced use of liquid nitrogen for cryogenic freezing and control rate freezing. And so how and where is that process step done?
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Along the lines of new thinking, I want to do another around the room with the panel for this next question. And this is something I've been reflecting on quite a bit personally and professionally the last few weeks to month or so is, COVID and the pandemic and the response to that has really made all of us rethink, our operations, how we access our facilities and our offices, how we manage our workforce, how we design our facilities. And honestly, a lot of these changes are good. They're changes that we should have done. I can think of several things that our firm now does differently, that once the pandemic is over, we're not going back to the old way. We're staying because it's forced us to think differently and to come up with new and innovative ways of doing things. So I'd love, everybody on the panel's thoughts around, what have you seen that are new ways of thinking, new approaches that have been forced upon us through the pandemic, that we're not going to go back to the old way. The new way is better, and we're going to continue forward. So, you know, Francesca, looks like you have your thinking face on. So I don't know if you've got something in mind that you'd like to share to start us off.
Well, I think relative to COVID-19 and manufacturing operations, when we think there, the biggest things that are being considered and where we're going to go is, one, of course, is their gown change and, you know, wearing masks and doing things, even as you say, from coming into the building, and then, you know, doing another change when you start to go into the process areas and doing the other overgowning. And in addition, even those spaces where in the past there was not a requirement for gowning, such as maybe they were non-classified spaces or CNC. Well, now they're starting to look at, maybe we need to apply a basic level of gowning so that we can be extra assured that we're reducing that risk of contamination coming into the facility itself. And certainly some of these places are already doing a level of testing, be it taking temperature and things like that of the people that are coming. That may not necessarily continue once we have a treatment, but it still is the kind of thing that needing to be given consideration for. Then one of the things that's getting a lot more consideration in the design of these facilities, and I was in a discussion on this both yesterday as well as today for these facilities, is what additional sterilization or validation procedures should we be applying to affect the spaces. And these spaces are not ISO 5 grade A spaces, but the general manufacturing. And so there's a greater consideration for the application of vapor phase hydrogen peroxide, sterilization, sanitization of the rooms, and even the ductwork. And that is something that, of course, we've always applied to isolator technology, and that's not new for that. But because of the added use of viruses, both from the viral vector, but also now the risk of chronic, it's something that's getting much more consideration as a control measure to be applied.
Thank you. How about you, John? What are you seeing in terms of new practices, new ways of thinking that, you know, you imagine are, this just needs to be the way we do it now, that is going to carry forward in a post COVID-19 pandemic world?
Yeah, it's a good question, Aaron. I think part of I'll say the jury is out because the changes are still evolving as to what's going on. But I do agree with you. I think we're going to see a lot of adaptations that are occurring right now that will become part of business as usual. What we're doing right now, I think, is one of them. You know, we all were used to Zoom meetings before COVID. Now that's all we have. So I think, you know, collectively we've become more comfortable with meeting this way. But when it comes down into the operations themselves, I think one of the things that both Francesca, you and Nissan have talked about is the idea of automation. How can we look at extending the automation within facilities to reduce the amount of human touch that's required? In the process, both to the PAT initiative from, like, I forgot how long ago that came out, which was a way for the FDA to say to the pharmaceutical companies, guys, make changes, update, try to you know, get with the times here. We're not going to penalize you for that. And yet most companies still have been reluctant to do that because of the impact of validation. Well, these changes that we're seeing now are going to require you to relook at the validation process. So it's a great time to look at operations overall, and just paying attention like that. I think that's probably one of the big things we're seeing is the increased interest in automation. It's a slow process. It'll take time, but I think that will continue. And then the last one, which I had mentioned before, is the attention to workers, what they're doing, how they move throughout a facility, what they do throughout a facility. In the past, if they weren't in an area that required gowning, nobody was really noticing where they were, what they were doing, or how effective they were able to be in their jobs. Now that's a much bigger part of operations. So I think we'll begin to see and maintain some of the improved process flows as well that will be coming out of this, and those will be permanent for organizations. So like you said, Aaron, I think a lot of these things in this situation that none of us would have asked for, there's a lot of good things that do have the capacity to come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it feels a little odd talking about silver linings when we're looking at the big picture and the impact that it has on people's lives, but it's certainly exposed some, like I said, some new ways of thinking and ways we can improve and do better. How about you, Lynn? What do you see best practices, things that we can carry forward post-pandemic?
Well, what we've heard, just to piggyback on what you mentioned, there's obviously going to be a reconfiguration of office space. We're working with a lot of companies that have office space, corporate headquarters, and, what we've heard is that 60% of those office workers prefer to work remotely. I mean, so that's huge. Like a year ago, I'm sure none of them were working remotely, or just a very small percentage. But then again, there are those that, want and need that human interaction. So I think having said all of that, when companies are, as we've heard, many of the companies are in the design stage, they're taking all of that into consideration, because if 60% of those employees prefer to work remotely they're just as productive, then their configuration will be smaller. We've heard that maybe there'll be some shared space. Maybe the employee will come in, twice a week, do some type of hybrid. And so it's a huge change. And, I think only the future will tell.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting a few years down the road doing a post-mortem on 2020 and with the benefit of hindsight, what we did right, what we did wrong, and what goes forward. So Nissan, I would love your thoughts on that question as well. What can we carry forward as continuing sustainable improvements from what we've learned this year?
One of the things is to get rid of manual testing. Microbials that are done right now, if we have a water system, as an example, a hot water system, a WFI water system with 40 use points, every day they measure those use points in order to find out if there's any microbials. Most of the time it's 0 counts. That could be automated and done online. 40 points a year at each point, costing about $250 for incubation, sampling, labor, and overhead. It means people are spending $1.2 million a year on manual sampling that gives them no readings, that has no benefit, where an online rapid microbial monitor costs $60,000 to $70,000. There's an immediate savings, and then we can take the labor aspect, those people, and put them into more productive areas rather than making manual samples in order to take back to a laboratory, which is absolutely ludicrous. So one thing is reduce the labor, get rid of a lot of these manual aspects that we've been doing for decades upon decades, looking at the automation, much like what John said also, but also start to think about what are the implications that we do to every manufacturing and process that we use. More continuous processes mean faster throughput, better throughput. We have more integrated in situ monitoring instrumentation, which can tell us exactly what's going on with those fermentation tanks, those single use points, or those multiple use points in a cellular operation. Those data points need to be totally under both risk-based management, CPP, critical process parameters, CQA, quality attributes, and being able to assess how we're manufacturing with less errors, better throughput, and less deviations. And that's what we need. We need the data, the instrumentation, and the knowledge in order to move forward. That's what PAT was done when assigned by the FDA in 2004. Use the process to gain the knowledge. The better knowledge you have about the process, the better product you're going to produce. You cannot produce a good product with a bad process. You cannot produce a bad product with a good process.
Great, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate everybody's thoughts on this. And with that, we are now at 4 o'clock. So I really want to thank all of our speakers for sharing all of your expertise. I also want to thank our audience for joining today's panel discussion and for submitting real thoughtful questions that I hope spurred some additional thoughts that everyone will take away from this session. So on the behalf of ISPE Boston, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I want to thank you for being a part of our first Fall Educational Summit. And I hope that everybody finds something interesting to take away from the coming 3 weeks of this summit. So with that, we will wrap things up, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.